that this fellow was his relative caused the Baldin to forget his tinus, and it was held against Rav Anan, and that he temporarily lost Gilu Eliyahu. And by tefillah and by fasting, he was able to restore the Gilu Eliyahu, but it was still with a little bit of fear, and that's why he had to sit inside a box whenever he learned with Eliyahu Navi, and the limudim that he learned with Eliyahu Navi out of the box was called Eliyahu Rabbah, and the limudim that he learned with Eliyahu inside the box was called Eliyahu Zuta, which takes us to about 9-10 lines down from the top of Daf Kuf Vav Amud Aleph. The Shoni de Rabbi Yosef have a rischa. In the days of Rabbi Yosef, there was a rischa. Rashi says what a rischa means on the fourth one. Rashi kas shalmakai. There was anger of the Rebbeinu Shloim, who bo rov lo'ilam, and it led to a hunger. So it wasn't stomach hunger. Otherwise, it was a kafna. It said it was a kas. I'm not sure how exactly they knew that it was a kas shalmakai, but the Gedolei lo'ilam knew. Could be, but it's Nagaya with the next point that the Gemara makes. Amalei Rabbanan Rabbi Yosef. Rabbanan told Rabbi Yosef, "Liboi marachmi. Why don't you daven? And if you daven, it will take care of us." Omer lehu. So Rabbi Yosef answered, "Hashta. Let's look. Uma Elisha. Madach Elisha the Navi. Surely his tefillah would be better than my tefillah." And in such a situation, Elisha did not daven. Uma Elisha, Madach Elisha. When the Rabbanan left him, even when the Talmidim left, there's many Talmidim who remain by him. Have a Paishi remain by him. Trey Alfan Umason Rabbanan. 2,200 Rabbanan remain by him. And Rashi explains the Chimiftri Talmid of Mimenu Lamed Bebeis Hamedrish. Have a Paishi Gabei Oichle Shulchanai. How many people ate by the table who didn't go home because the yeshiva was their home? Trey Alafim Umasayim. We learned yesterday a pasuk that taught us that bringing money, bringing a gift to a Talmud Chacham is like Bikurim. And what did the pasuk say? Esrim lechem, 20 lechem, the lechem Bikurim, and 1 lechem of Bikurim. That's so far a total of 21. Ha'esrim b'chad. Then the pasuk says the caramel, another bread of barley. Hari esim utartin. So there were 22 breads that were presented to Elisha. V'chol echad lifnei mea ish. And each one of these breads served 100 people. So if there are 22 breads, and each bread served 100 people, there must have been 2,200 people who were in the yeshiva full time. Hare Trei Alfinu Masai. Now, how do you know that these fed 100 men? So that's what the Gemara is going to lead into now. So nevertheless, even though his yeshiva had full-time students that ate in the yeshiva of 2,200 Talmidim, nevertheless, Trei Alfinu Masai, nevertheless, Be'idin Rischa, when there was a Rischa by Elisha's days, Loi Hava Boy Rachmi. He didn't ask, he didn't daven, because I guess he knew it wouldn't help. And that's how do we know Elisha wasn't by Rachmi? Because if he would have, it would have helped. And there was a hunger there, and the hunger didn't go away. So obviously Elisha didn't daven. So Ana me, little Rabbi Yosef, Iboy Rachmi. I should ask for Rachamim. So the shaila is, don't you always daven for Rachamim? So it seems like the unfortunate we got, that's why just have a risk on not kafna. A normal case in Klal Yisrael's b'shas tzara about the Yidavim. But here they knew there was a special resichos, maybe because there was a very Klal Yisrael did. But the Eden Rischa, you see that Elisha didn't have it. Frek the Gemara, Umimai, the Paishi, how do you know that all of these Talmidim, 2,200 Talmidim, were there full time? How do we know this? So tomorrow, Umay the Paishi Achi. So tomorrow, the Chsiv says in the Pasuk, right after the pasuk that we quoted yesterday, from which we brought to Raya, that giving a matana to a Talmud Chacham is like Bikurim. The next pasuk says, "Vayoyim Misharsai," the Misharis of Elisha, who was receiving these gifts, said to Elisha, "Ma eten zeh lifnei me'aish." So, what should I give these in front of 100 people? So, what does it mean? Put this in front of 100 people. My lifnei me'aish. Exactly, what did the shliach, did the shamis, did the masharis want to put in front of 100 ish? If all 22 breads were designed to feed 100 men total, that's not bad at all. That's a lot. So the Masharis was asking him, how am I going to feed all the people with these breads? What type of question would that have been? In a year of hunger, using 22 breads to feed 100 people isn't bad at all. Ella, it must be the cholchad v'chad kamemeish. The question was, we have 2,200 people. So how am I going to put one bread in front of 100 people? And therefore, you see from here that Elisha had 2,200 full-time Talmidim, yet he still didn't daven beaten rischa. She held, it wouldn't help. So little Rabbi Yosef, I should daven. When the Talmidim would leave the house of Rav, the yeshiva of Rav, after his year, have a paisha alpha umason rabbanon, 1,200 people. So he didn't have 2,200 full-time Talmidim in his dormitory, in his dining room. He only had 1,200 Talmidim. Mibei Rav Huna, when they left the household of Rav Huna, have a paisha tamni meir rabbanon, 800 rabbanim remained. So he had 800 full-time students. Rav Huna have a dorish betleser amiroi. Rav Huna, when he darshaned, they didn't have microphones in those days. So he would have 12 people around him, each one broadcasting to a different group of Talmidim. So you see, he had many, many Talmidim. And he have a kaimi rabbanon, he misifted the Rav Huna, and when the people got up to go home from the misifted of Rav Huna, the naftzig l'mayu, they would spread out their clothing, because when they were sitting down, your clothing are a little bit zikneched, but when you stand up, you spread them out. It created such a dust storm. Have a solak avka, there was such a dust storm. It actually darkened. It actually went dark in the neighborhood from all the dust that came off of the clothing that had settled on the Talmidim. That's how much dust there was. And this was in Bavel. In Eretz Yisrael, they used to say, they must have just finished Shir. They must have just finished Shir in Bavel because it darkened the clouds all the way to Eretz Yisrael. So there are those who learn that that's not possible. It just means it's a guzma. It means there was such a cloud of dust that it darkened it in Bavel. But there are those who learn, I think the Yad explains, that whenever there was like a dust storm in Eretz Yisrael, people would say, it must be that the shear just ended by Rav Huna, but not that it actually was the same dust storm. It was just known by people that there was such a dust storm whenever the shear of Rav Huna ended. So anytime there was a big dust storm, wherever it was, they would say, this must be from the Mesivta of Rav Huna. Zok Gemara, Kimif to be Rabbanon, Mibe Rabba, Rabbi Yosef, when the Rabbanon would leave from the house of Rabbi and Yosef, Apaishi Arba Meya Rabbanon. They had a small yeshiva, they only had 400 Talmidim that were there full time. And the Koil Nafshar Yasmi, they called themselves Yisoimim. In other words, we have nothing. What do we have in Ganson 400 full time Talmidim? Kavamif to Rabbanon, Mibe Abaye. When the Rabbanon would leave Abaye's household, Ramila Mibe Rapapa, Ramila Mibe Rab Ashi, and Apaishi Mos on the Rabbanon. There were only 200 Talmidim. The Koil Nafshar Yasmi, they Yasmi. They considered themselves Yisoimim of Yisoimim. We're extremely unfortunate. We only have so few Talmidim. You know, someone once spoke out that they made at the Khan in Lakewood that no girls' school is allowed to open in September, the beginning of the year, until every girl has a place. They also made a takana that no misifta is allowed to open until each Rosh Hashiva has at least one Talmud. So that everybody should have a Talmud. So they were Yasmin. Okay, Gavalti.
So the brother one time told me when he got angry at his Talmud in the yeshiva by Kaplan, he said, I'll throw every single bocher out. I'll have nobody here, but I'll have a yeshiva.
Omri Ab Yitzchak Bar Difa Amar Bami. Mevakre Mumin Shabirushalayim. There were people who full time they checked animals for mumin, people who were bringing karbanos. Who paid them? They were offering it's a public service. So they took their pay from the Trumas Halishka. So let's see Rashi what these mevakre. There's no Rashi on it. There's no Rashi. So what Tosha speaks about, a mevakre mumin. So Tosha speaks about if it's for heter b'choros. She says it's not for heter b'choros because there's always an incentive to find a mum. But it means for regular karbonis, they service the public, so they were paid from Trumas Halishka. What is Trumas Halishka? So there's different pots of money. There are different funds in the Beis Hamikdash. The main fund was that every year it was required of every year to give a machzas a shekel, and all that money was put into one big fund, and was actually put into multiple big barrels, and then 3 times throughout the year they would take some out of it, which would be called the Truma Salishka, and from that Truma Salishka, from what they took out, from the funds that they took out of the big pot, those funds were used to buy karbonis with, the karbonis tzibur, that everybody in Klal Yisrael has to have a part of. But there was sometimes extra funds, even from the Truma Salishka, that they took for the karbonis, even from there were extra funds, and it's those funds that they used to pay the people who mavak the mumin, because that's all part of a function of the karbonis. It's part of the requirements of bringing the karbonis, so they were paid from that fund. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Talmidei Chachamim hamalamdim hilchos shchita lekayhanim. The Talmidei Chachamim who taught hilchos shchita to the kayhanim, hoyu noitlen schorim mitrumas halishka. They're also doing a public service. They also took their schar mitrumas halishka. Now this is a little bit of an interesting thing. This teaching the kayhanim how to shach. Let's see Tosfos on it. There's a one-line Tosfos. Malamdim hilchos. Oh, I'm sorry, Kamitza, but this is it's related to us. Why is it that Malika isn't mentioned? Malika is the type of shchita that's used for birds. The question is, a Yisrael cannot do Malika, that we understand. But can a Yisrael do shchita? We know the halach is shchita k'sher bazar. So if shchita is k'sher bazar, why did they need special instruction to the Kayhanim how to shech if they did not, if a Yisrael can shech, so the teacher who is going to be teaching the Kayhanim, let him shech. If you have people who know how to shech, let those who know how to shech. Why do they need to offer courses in shechita to make sure the Kayhanim know how to shech if the Yisraelim could shech? It's shechita k'sher bazar. So in fact, there was a big shaila. If even though shechita is k'sher bazar, lechatchila maybe a kohen should shech. So for sure, by the karbonis tibur, like the carbon talmud, there's an inyan that the kohen should shech. As a matter of fact, one of the paisos, one of the geirolos that they made to distribute who did which avodah was for shechita. You might ask, why would that be one of the paisos? That could even be done by Yisrael. So for sure, the karbonis tibur, it's ideal for a kohen to shech. But what about if you bring a carbon? If you bring a carbon to yourself, maybe it's the lechatchila that the person who brings the carbon should shech this carbon, if it's k'sher bazar. So there is such a shaila, and there are those who brings down. I don't have the information behind it, that this was actually a machloikis between Shmuel Hanavi and Eli HaKohen, because there was a time where Shmuel was going to be mechuyev misa because he was moyer halacha b'fnei rabbi, and it was this halacha that they were discussing whether or not l'chatchila a Yisrael should check if he brings a korban, or l'chatchila should a kohen check. So if l'chatchila the kohen should check, then it makes sense that the public funds, the funds of the korbanos, the funds that pay for the korbanos, should be used to teach the kohanim how to check. Amar Gidol Marav, Talmid Chachamim, Hamalamdim Hilchas Kmitza LaKohanim, the Talmid Chacham who teach kohanim how to do kmitza, again, Noitlin Svorim Mitrumas Alish. Amar Rabba Barbachano, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Magiei Svorim Shabirushalayim. So what does this have to do with the Beis Hamikdash? Those who corrected the Svorim in Yerushalayim, they also were paid. How you Noitlin Svorim Mitrumas Alishka, they also get from the public purse. So let's have a look at what this is and why it's appropriate for them to get paid from the korban fund. So let's see what Rashi says over here. Rashi says, Magiei Svarim shall kol adam v'adam. This was actually not done to service the Beis Hamikdash. Personal svarim. People who had personal svarim there was a public free service to check personal svarim. Why? She'asur lahasher sefer she'enei muga. You're not allowed to keep in your home a sefer that's not edited properly. Mishum al tishkain b'yalech avla. You shouldn't have, the pasuk says you shouldn't have in your household, in your tent, an avla, some wrong, and a wrong sefer can cause problems. The row Bezdin show you must atlim b'davar. Bezdin saw that people were not careful to make sure that all the svarim in their households are pure. They set aside money from the karbanos to be magias svarim. I'm not one to preach, but I can imagine if they were concerned about having svarim in their house that wasn't perfect, that they were mafker mois carbon to fix. How much of mois carbon would they be mafker to take out tumah from people's houses? If you have televisions in your house or internet, not that I'm someone who's preaching against internet, but you see how careful they were that any reading material, anything that anyone in the family might ingest should be pure and perfect. Ad kedei kach, that they were mafkir moment hektish that's designated for karbonas to keep people's households clean. I can see a mishkiach making a good shmooze out of this.
The issue I would have told the mashkiach that the issue that they had in those days was that storm was copied one from the other.
Right.
So a safer that had mistakes in it.
It would spread quickly.
Yeah.
I hear. Yeah, but the internet spreads good from one house to another too.
True, but it doesn't. Okay, it's possible.
Okay, so let's see the Gemara right here. Amar Nachman Amar Rav. Noshima argos beparoichas. Women who would weave the paroichas. In today's woke generation, they would say, "Well, who does noshim?" But then noshim, it's noshim. Who argues beparoichas? Noshim argues beparoichas. You have to first know what a woman is. Make face, it's offensive. But noshim argues beparoichas. Who pays them? Noitlin schar b'trumas alishka. They take their schar b'trumas alishka. So we're going to have to analyze: is a paroichas a function of the karbanos, or is the paroichas like a wall of the Beis Hamikdash? What if a wall of the Beis Hamikdash cracks? What money do they use to pay for that? Not trumas alishka. They don't use the money that's designated for karbanos. There's a separate pot that's called bedek habayis, where people will donate to the Beis Hamikdash, building materials or anything that of value. So the question is, that's what the Gemara is going to discuss, the paroichas, which are part of the structure of the Beis Hamikdash. Why is it appropriate that they should be paid for with money from the Trumas Halish? Well, but Rav Nachman says, I disagree. I think should be mikached by the kabayis. Why? Because hoyle paroichas tachas bidin asuris. The paroichas is made as part of the building, so that should be paid for with the building maintenance fund, not with the karbanos fund. Makes me freight the Gemara from a price. Noshima argues the paroichas ubeis garmu. Beis Gomer were the people, were the family who knew the secret of how to make lechem aponim. Ubeis Gormu al ma'isa lechem aponim. Ubeis Aftinas, they were the experts in making the ketayos. Ubeis Aftinas al ma'isa ketayos kulan hayunoit lo yischoren mitrumas alishka. So you see a brisa that argues with the Nachman, who says that the paroichos was trumas alishka. Vice the chayos is not building oriented, rather it's carbon oriented. So Gemara hasam bidabavi. These were on the gates. So there were certain gates, like between the Kodesh and Kodesh Kadoshim. Those are part of the actual building of the Beis Hamikdash. But then there were gates that were just there for tznius ba'alma, and those were as a function of the karbanis, so not everybody could just see. It should be more tznua, and those came from Trumas Halishka. Damar Abzeir Amarav, Shloish Asa Parechas Hayu b'Mikdash Sheni. There were 13 parechas in the Mikdash Sheni, which I believe Rashi says would be paid for with Bedek Abayis. Shiva Kineged Shiva Shar. 7 of the parechas were by the 7 gates. Echad lePeschai shel Heichel. One was at the opening of the Heichel. The Echad lePeschai shel Ulam. And one was at the opening of the Ulam. Beis B'Dvir. There were 2 parechas in between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And Beis Kinegdon Baaliyah. And there were 2 parechas in the attic on top of the Kodesh and Kodesh Kodeshim. There was also 2 parechas to separate the attic space of the Kodesh from the attic space of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And Rashi tells us that those 7 parechas and the Oishon parechas nasu mekache bedek habayis. Those were part of the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, so it would be appropriate that they should be taken care of by the building fund, by the maintenance fund. But there were many other parechas that were just there for tznius. They're not part of the building, and therefore those parechas were paid for from the Trumas Halishka because they're just made to create some tznius at the time of the Kabbalahs. Taner Rabbanan, Noshim HaMegadlos B'neim L'Para. The Para Aduma was done with extreme care to keep things tahar. The reason why it was so extreme to make anything with the Para Aduma, to focus on Tahira, is because the Tzaddikim would say that at Tful Yoim, somebody who became Tomei, let's say with a sheretz, and then toivel that day, but didn't yet wait for nighttime to arrive, the Tzaddikim said that such a person cannot be involved in preparing the Paraduma. While halacha is, which we learn from Limudim that Chazal teach us, that in fact a Tful Yom is allowed to be Osik in the Paraduma. Because there was this claim of the Tzaddikim, whenever they prepared a Paraduma, they bedavka were matama, the kohen who was being Osik with the Paraduma with a sheretz, and they had him go to the mikveh, and he prepared it that day to show them that you're wrong. The problem is, once there's such a public show of lack of concern for the kedusha of the paraduma, in every other way they went over and above to make it uber tahar. So they wanted the children or the people that worked on the paraduma to have never become tamei in their lives. So what they would do is they would take women that were pregnant and they would put them on plateaus. So they would build platforms out of stone. So stone aren't makabel tumah. They would build them a couple of tvachim above the ground so that if there's any mace buried below that they weren't aware of, that tumah is going to come up, it's going to be blocked by the floor, that's their elevated floor, because that creates an oil underneath the floor. And everything on top of this platform would be for sure 100% tar. But that means this person has to cut themselves off from their normal life and live in these separate buildings. How are they going to survive? Who paid them? Again, this was a function of bringing the paraduma, so therefore this is considered part of the carbon fund, and therefore they were paid from Trumas Halishka.
How many women did they use?
I'm not sure how many women did it, but they had women.
It's not like just because you pay somebody, they're ready to live in isolation. I mean, she's cutting herself off from her family. They paid their husband.
No, they paid, the husband paid them.
They couldn't do my Shidayim.
Two vacations.
It's amazing. It's amazing how far the Rabbanan went, because this is it seems like a seemingly small machlokus in an issue that's derisa, and then they go incredibly the other way midrabanan to protect this tiny machlokus midraisa. Could you would come back and say
Wash it to doikim.
the gezerah that the Rabbanan making is much more.
There were many other chumash as well.
Much stronger.
Much off the charts because they were afraid that people would think that we take it lightly. So I would call this place where they stayed at the Hard Rock Motel. That's where they stayed. Okay. Abba Shol Omer. Noshim Yikarish of Yerushalayim, it was not taken from Trumas Alishka. The wealthy women of Yerushalayim, they would send them on. Boy Minei, and Rashi means not only did they have food, they also had clothing. Boy Minei Rav Huna Meirav. So Rav Huna had a Shaila of Rav. Now that we're discussing the different functions that were on the Beis Hamikdash and which funds pay for them, what about a Klei Sharis? So what is a Klei Sharis? Shemesharsin Bahem b'Mizbeach Achitzoin Shu Binyan Shalavada. The Mizbeach Achitzoin is part of the structure of the Beis Hamikdash. It's built of stone. The kalim that were used, shovels and forks, all the different kalim that they had to use to service the Mizbeach Achitzoin, Ma'u Sheyasu Mikoche Bedek Habayis. Should they be paid for with funds of Bedek Habayis? Do you say Tzorech Mizbeach Ninu? They service the Mizbeach, and the Mizbeach is the Mizbeach Adam, it's connected to the ground, and therefore with Koche Bedek Habayis also, they should be paid for with Koche Bedek Habayis. Or maybe they're Tzorech of the carbon, and they were brought from the Trumas Alishka, because for their kabbanis. Well, before we go back, I just want to mention today is the yahrzeit of the Barditchevet, who was the ultimate in being Melech Yosher for Klal Yisrael. And it's also the yahrzeit of the Chassam Sofer. Yeah, same day. I don't know if they died on the same day, on the same year, but it's the same day of the month. They both died. So I just want to share over a Sharf Maisa that Duri Samuels told me about the Chassam Sofer that he heard from the Matas Tafaru. There was once a Malshin in the city of the Chassam Sofer, I guess it was in Preshburg, and he would threaten, if you don't give me X dollars, he would shake people down. I'm going to be Malshin on you this, I'll be Malshin on you that. So one day, in the middle of Shir, the administrators of the yeshiva came rushing in and told the Chassam Sofer, this Malshin, his name was Simcha. Simcha now was threatening that he's going to be Malshin on the yeshiva and they're going to shut the yeshiva down because we didn't want to give him his payout. So Chassam Sofer says, don't worry, nobody's shutting down our yeshiva. And this Malshin Simcha steps out of his house, and as soon as he stepped out of his house, he had a seizure. His tongue blocked his airway, and he was choking. So they ran to the Chassam Sofer and told the Chassam Sofer, Rebbe, do something. So the Chassam Sofer said, I already did. The person died. So the Chassam Sofer asked that by his levaya, they should bring his Oren past the yeshiva, because the Chassam Sofer wanted to speak by his levaya. So when they brought the mita of this Simcha past the yeshiva, the Chassam Sofer came out and said, Simcha l'artzecha, na v'sasain li'recha. Okay, so to go on. So they said these klishores, they should be made from the Trumas Alishka. They're a function of the karbanos. It says in the pasuk in Ksuvim in Divrei Hayamim, when they finished doing whatever they needed to do with the money that they had of Bedek Habayis, they brought in front of the Melech and Yoyada a shara kesef, the leftover money, and what do they do with it? So you see that they used money of Bedek Habayis to make the klisharis. Omer lay. So he told them back. Who was speaking to who? Let me just look back on Nomer Aleph. Who was this discussion? It was Rav Huna from Rav. So Rav told him, the Akayich Ksuvi, whoever taught you Ksuvim, taught you Divrei Hayamim, Lo Akayich Navi, did he not teach you Navi as well, which you should have learned before Ksuvim? And in the Navi it says Fakert. It says Achlo Yasa, Beis Hashem Svais, Ki La'isum Malacha Yitnu. The extra money should pay all the laborers who worked on the Beis Hamikdash. But it doesn't say you put it to the Kalim. So, Frek the Gemara, Yihachi Kashu Kuradadi. You have a pasuk in Ksuvim which indicates that the leftover of the list of the Bedek Habayis went to the Kalim, yet we say that the leftover has to go to the workers. If there's extra, even after all the workers are paid, yeah, then you can use it for the Klisharis as well. However, but in Melachim Beis, it's where there wasn't extra after the workers were paid to also use for the Klisharis. But even so, even if there's extra money, if it's misappropriated funds, if Bedek Habayis money isn't supposed to be used for klei sharis, just because it's extra, it doesn't mean you could misapply it. It doesn't mean you could apply the funds to where it's not supposed to be used. It's lev bezdin masna aleihem. Bezdin has a koyach to make a t'nai on all of the donations that are given as follows. Im hutzruchu, if they're needed for the normal function of building or repairing the Beis HaMikdash, that's what they'll be used for. But vimlav yu l'klisharis. There's a t'nai in every donation given for Melech Habayis that if it's redundant funding, it could be used to make klisharis. Tana Dvei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel learned, Klei Sharis boy mitrumas alishka. Klei Sharis comes mitrumas alishka. Shinemar, because it says es shar hakesef. They took the leftover kesef. Now, why is there? When is there ever something called leftover kesef? The only time there's a leftover kesef is if there's kesef and we make a truma. We take some of the kesef, and the leftover kesef is called shar kesef. So where do you find truma? By trumas alishka. So everyone gave a chazi shekel, and they make a trumas alishka, and then the money that remains in the pot, that's the shar kesef. Ezeu kesef sheyesh lo shirayim. What type of kesef has leftovers? Hava oimer zeh trumas alishka. So that's how we know. That's how we know. So Rabbi Shmuel that klei sharis are purchased with the leftover money from the trumas alishka. In fact, the more be'ema shirayim gufayu. Maybe it's the shirayim itself. So what does this mean? What does it mean shirayim gufayu? So Rashi explains to us mishirayim hanesorim belishka klisharis boin v'loimin trumatz. So there's two parts of money. We have the chatzi shekel, the machzah shekel that everybody gave. That fills up the lishka. 3 times a year, they would take a truma from that lishka to buy karbonos with. Now, what if they had extra money, even after they bought all their karbonos, they have extra from the trumas lishka. So the Dvei Rabbi Shmuel wanted to say that it's the extra from the trumas lishka. The Gemara is asking, who said it's the extra from the trumas lishka? Maybe it's the leftover after the truma was taken away. So let's say they bring in $1 million and the trumas lishka is $100,000, right? They take from the lishka, they take some out. So is it the leftover from that $100,000, or is it the remaining that was in the pot after the truma, which is the $900,000 that was left in the pot? So you want to say it's from the extra of the trumas lishka, the ema shirayim gufayu. Maybe it's what didn't get taken off in the trumas lishka. Maybe it's what remained in the chamber. Zakta Gemara kid amarava. It says ha'oila when we refer to the carbon tamid. Zoy is ha'oila. Since it says ha'oila with the heya yediyah, it tells us that it's referring to the first carbon of the day, the carbon tamid. Oila rishayna. Hachanami. It said in the pasuk that they should take hakesef. It says a shar hakesef. So kesef rishayn. It's not referring to the funds that were left in the lishka after the truma. It's actually referring to the money of the truma itself that they didn't need to buy karbonos with. Meisha Frek to Gemara. HaKetoris. The whole karbonos tzibur, the Ketoris, and all of the karbonos tzibur, boyim mitrumas alishka are paid for from the trumas alishka. It's obvious. It's all the karbonos. Mizbech hazov ulevoina uchlisharis. So we're focused on the klisharis. Boyin mimoiser nesachim. It comes from the leftover money that was used for the nesachim. So they used to buy flowers that there was extra of sometimes. And Rashi explains how would they have extra flowers. The way they would have extra flowers is when the merchant provided any type of shear of flour, it was always heaping. But in the carbon, they actually had a flat shear. So there was always that extra, that money they used. That's one shot. The other shot is what happens if the merchant makes up with the Beis HaMikdash to provide a pound of flour for $1. And then when it comes time to delivering it, the price of flour drops, and with $1 you can buy 2 pounds. So we say that the Yad Beis HaMikdash is always al hel yoina, and the merchant has to provide the 2 pounds. So now there's extra flour there. So these are 2 ways where there would be extra supplies for the nesachim. So that's what paid for the klisharis. Mizbech ha'olah alishkos v'azoros boin mikache bedakabayis. Chutz l'chay misazar. Anything that had to be fixed out of the walls of the azara, boin mishiyari alishkos, that came from the leftover funds that were left in the lishka, that was not taken for their kabbalas. Zui Shishaninu, this is what we learned. Chayma Seir, the wall of the city, Umigla Sen, its towers, its guard towers and posts, the whole Tzorchayir, and all of the communal needs for the city, Boin Mishyari Alishka, that they used funds from the Machzas HaShekel, but the funds that were not taken off for the Karbanis, the funds that were made in the pot, that's what pays for those things. But I'll call upon them, we have here a Machlokes Tanoim about the Klei Sharis. Here it says that the Klei Sharis are Mimoser Nisachim, and earlier we said that the Klei Sharis are from the Shiari Alishka. So tomorrow Tanoi, in fact, it's a Machlokes Tanoi. It's not we learned Moiser Truma Mahu Ya'osimba. What do they do with the extra money from the Trumas Alishka? So they used to do with it Rikuye Zov Tzipul base Kacheh Kodishim. The base Kacheh Kodishim had gold paneling, and if the gold paneling was getting worn out, it needed to be replaced, they would flatten out the gold coins into a flat sheet of gold, and that's what they would use the extra gold for. I believe Rashi says it was also used for the floor, right? It was the walls and the floors were plated with gold. Moiser payers, if they had extra payers, and we'll soon see where were there any payers in the Beis Hamikdash that there should have been extra payers. With the extra money from the extra payers, they would purchase just extra karbanos, so that when there was no action in the Beis Hamikdash, they would bring karbanos. Moiser truma, the leftover of the truma salishka, goes to the klisharis. So here you see it's moiser truma leklisharis. Rabbi Kiva Omer, moiser truma is lekeitzah mizbeach. Any extra money from the truma salishka, they would buy more karbanos with. And moiser nesachim leklisharis. So you see over here, machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel holds moiser truma is leklisharis, and Rabbi Kiva says moiser nesachim is leklisharis. So you see a machlokes tanoim. What did they use? Which funds did they use to purchase klisharis? Rabbi Chanina's kana kehana maimer, moiser nesachim is lekeitzah mizbeach. The extra nesachim for that money they bought karbanos to keep the mizbeach busy. Moiser truma, the extra from the truma salishka was leklisharis. So in that respect, Rabbi Chanina agrees with Rabbi Kiva. V'zeh, both Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Chanina disagree with Rabbi Shmuel's point about moiser peiros l'keitzah mizbeach. V'zeh loy hayu moedim b'peiros. Everybody, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina disagreed with Rabbi Shmuel, who said something about moiser peiros. They disagreed about moiser peiros. So what are moiser peiros? Peiros mai. What are these peiros? To tell you, moiser truma mahoyu oishima. What do they do with the extra money if they finish buying all the karbonos that they needed and they still had extra money? What do they do with it? So the Tanakama says, loichim peris bezoil. They would buy peris for cheap. First of all, that money they were buying in bulk. A. B is Hektish always got a better deal on what they purchased. So they bought peris for cheap, and then they would sell them at concession stands for people coming in, and they would make good money on it. The schar, what do they do with all the profit of this venture? Makitzin boyasim mizbeach. Rabbi Shmuel held that they used this money to buy extra karbanos for the mizbeach. The zui sheshaninu, and this is what Rabbi Shmuel meant when he said earlier, moiser peres lekeitzah mizbeach. It's the fruit industry that the Beis Hamikdash engaged in a venture in fruit. That money, the profit that venture made, bought extra karbanos. So my zev is zeh loy hayu the pairs. So what's up is Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Chanina disagree that such a venture occurred. The Tanan moiser shiyori lishka. What do they do with the extra money from the lishka? Ma hayu oisim ba loikcha ben yenois shemonim v'seltois. They would buy extra wine, oil, and flour, and then they would sell them. They would go into a business, baschar lahektish, and they would use the profit for hektish. That was the Rabbi Shmuel. But Rabbi Kiva Omer ein mistakrin b'shal hektish. You don't do business with moyes hektish. Af loy b'shal aniyim. You're not allowed to take tzedakah funds and put it into an investment and buy stocks with it. You're not allowed to do that. So af loy b'shal aniyim. B'shal hektish my time alone. Why is it inappropriate to use moyes hektish to invest in? Because ein anis b'makam ashiris. And this is the classic story that we always talk about. Melamed once said, If I would be as rich as Rothschild, I would be richer because I would tutor on the side, right? But the Beis Hamikdash doesn't pass say that because in a place of the Beis Hamikdash where it's all Ashiras, it's not appropriate to make extra money on the side because that's the act of Aeneas. No big Gvir is gonna open up a lemonade stand outside Shul so he can make an extra $1, right? And then these b'makam Ashiras. So therefore, it's not appropriate with Beis Hamikdash funds to go into business. My time alone. And why aren't you allowed to do business with money of a niyam? Why can't you invest it to create a fund? Tomorrow, because what if an ani comes and needs money right now and you don't have it, you have to liquidate. You always have to have money ready to go. Right? We know the story of Nachamish Gamza, right? He didn't have food in his pocket ready to go. We learned earlier in the Masechta that my Ukva's feet burnt in the oven when they ran into the oven, and his wife's feet didn't. Why? Because she always had food ready to go. And when it comes to an ani, you have to have it ready to go. You can't tell the ani, well, we need a month so that we can liquidate our fund so that we can get you the money. It has to go right away. Now, this whole concept of Einanis from Makam Ashiris is pretty interesting because you sometimes find the opposite. For instance, the halacha is that they have to deliver coals to the Mizbeach Hazov every day with a gold shovel. But the shovel that they used to take the coals off the Mizbeach Hachitzon was a silver shovel. The Kohen who got that avoider, who won it, would dig around in the coals and pull out a geschmack, a hot red coal, and he would transfer it over into a gold shovel and then bring it that way. And the reason for that is because if you use gold to dig into the coals, that gold is going to deteriorate very quickly. So that's why you use silver. Why? Because the Rebbeinu Shalom is worried it shouldn't cost us too much money. In the Parsha of Negoim, we have that before the Kohen comes to look at a Nigei Batim, you have to take all the Kalim out. Why? Because we don't want them to become tummy and get ruined. And that's only speaking about a Klicheres, because any metal Kalim you could toivel. So we're worried about a couple of coffee mugs that a guy has in his house. The Torah is worried about it. Why? Because again, so you find sometimes that concept, and sometimes you find Einanis b'makam Ashiris. So I forgot who spoke about it, but one of the Rishonim speak about it and says you cannot be medam double dover. Every individual case Chazal looked at, and they made an assessment. What's the right thing in this case? Is the right thing in this case to be chasam amon and shol Yisrael, or is the right thing in this case to say Einanis b'makam Ashiris? And for each different place, there's different reasons for it. Okay, we'll stop here, and we will be mamshich Bezos tomorrow.
I would thought that the floor of the Kodesh HaKadosh could have been made in silver.